Move on to the next question here, which is from Yuri. Here it is. And kind of similar related question. Those are synonyms. What are the limitations of immersion learning? Which aspects of language cannot be acquired through immersion within a reasonable time frame, i.e. a couple of years? In what instance is dedicated practice recommended? But I think we've just defined dedicated practice or deliberate practice a little bit differently. So what I think they're referring to is more of like deliberate study. When is that required or recommended, rather?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, in studying for the C2 Spanish exam, I, went down a bunch of YouTube rabbit holes. And the administrators of the exam, people who have like trained to administer it and also train other people in taking it, say, I could not pass the C2 without studying for it. These are native speakers.
Yeah, okay.
And so the fact that they have to study it in order to achieve the level that's desired by the test indicates to me that that is something that will never happen through immersion. Because the test is testing for something that's very specific, that is actually different than what you encounter on a day-to-day basis. And immersion can help with that. Like there's a lot of questions on the C2 test that are about sort of like what sounds natural in a given situation, or gives it a specific nuance, even though there's multiple correct answers. And that only comes from massive exposure to literature. But the ability to do the skills that are on the test are not things that come from immersion. So with that in mind, there are 100% absolutely like grammatical rules and specific literature patterns or the way that you take the test, and none of those things come from immersion. You really do need to study those.
I think you can kind of expand that to, so there's a lot of things that humans or people can only do through like deliberate teaching and exposure. A sort of really extreme example is being literate. If you're never exposed to a single, let's say, character of Chinese, and that you've been immersing in 20,000 hours of pure audio comprehensible input, you still won't be able to read. That's a thing you literally have to learn just because that is a thing that we've created. There's also a lot of things that come along with that, like good writing, clear writing, pretty much anything that you get from university or from even just basic like elementary and high school. But being able to effectively do math in your target language is a lot more different and more difficult than like it might think, because it doesn't just translate over, because there's slightly different ways things are thought about and taught that are also correct. Like there's so much out there that is not necessarily like human language acquisition related that we consider part of language. Like a lot of people have the goal of being able to sound like themselves in their target language, but that will require doing similar things that you've done and practicing similar things that you've practiced in your native language. But you often don't think about that as being something that you had to specifically do since you were forced to go to school for whatever, how many years, 15 years, or whatever school time is. And so pretty much everything in there, I would say, is where you kind of have to learn deliberately.
Yeah. I remember in regards to the numbers in math, Matt had a video where like he knew all of the numbers up to a certain point, and then beyond that, when he heard a number, it was just like big number. And I'm like, yes, I've experienced that same thing.
That's how I work in English, though. Honestly, like if somebody
I can't even repeat a number back to you in Spanish if it's too big.
Sure.
Whereas I can usually do that with English. And I also went down a pathway of like the ordinal numbers in Spanish, which like they come up in immersion, but it's not like every single one of them comes up in immersion.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to learn how to count in ordinal numbers as a separate skill than just the numbers themselves.
And then you add in things that are really like literal, like really rare. They're not used any time in spoken language, but everybody like gets them in school at some point. You're like, why do you know this? It's like, oh, like we learned it in 5th grade. And so everybody kind of knows it and is aware of it, but nobody ever says it. It's like, why does it exist? This is annoying.
Yeah.
Stuff like
Yeah,
that.
the accents in Spanish, like they're regular. They have rules,
Yeah.
and you can pick up a lot of it from immersion. But like even native speakers screw them up, and they had to study them and were tested on them in school because the rules like they exist and they're like very regular,
And they're pretty simple, actually.
and they're
But
pretty
still
simple rules.
hard.
Yeah, and yet like people screw them up constantly. People drop accents constantly. Like in our core server when I'm responding to Spanish speakers, like they never add accents to things.
I don't either. You don't need to. Oh, actually, just the other day, I was on a plane, and it was an American airline, and it was missing an accent on one of the like translations. I was like, this should have an accent on it. And on the Mexican airline, it does have an accent. It's the exact same thing. It does have an accent. It's like, come on.
Yeah,
I mean,
someone didn't.
I know it doesn't matter, but also like you can just use a spell checker. It's free nowadays.
Yeah, and then like the CFR test, they like you have to use the accent, and you got to use them like according to the rules. You can mark down for that,
Which is kind of crazy to me. But anyways,
so anyway, those are all examples of things that like immersion learning does not give you. It gives you like a base foundation, but you still got to practice to get them right.
Mm-hmm. And again, going back to the stage 3 versus stage 4 thing, you can pick and choose. I personally don't care if I can use accents or not, and so I don't really focus on it. I have a general idea of the rules, so I can kind of guess, but also I've got language tool. I don't care. I don't care about my spelling in English. But anyways, thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer, Ethan.